So here's a statement that has been around forever. We've all heard it. Most of us have used it at one point in our lives. And it contains one of the biggest lies that has ever been put upon the human race. Why we continue to recite this as some kind of mantra, I have no idea, but we do. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You know, you can shoot somebody in the head with a bullet and kill them in the flesh. Words are a little different, but they kill too. Words penetrate the heart and the mind, and they kill the spirit. Most of us, even if you're watching this at a young age, knows somebody who's been labeled. They may have been labeled stupid or ugly or awkward or retarded. Maybe you're one of those people. The problem is if you accept that label, sooner or later you grow into it. And it limits your life in unforeseen ways, negative ways. And in a way it's murder. Many years ago, I knew a woman, didn't know her well, but I crossed trails with her a few times. She was middle-aged, probably 42, 43 years old, stunningly beautiful. Married to a successful surgeon. She herself was a school teacher with a college education. So she came from a stable household. She had 3 grown children, late teens to early 20s. She had labels for her children. The one, she said, "This is my stupid one." It was her daughter. She said she was born stupid and she never outgrew it. She labeled her second one, also a girl, her ugly one. She said she didn't just go through an ugly duckling phase, she stayed in it. I don't know what she called her third grown child. Maybe he or she was lucky enough to be born both good looking and intelligent and escape his mother's judgments. What does that do to children, to young people? You know, maybe her attitudes never got back to these young people, but probably they did in one way or another. This woman ultimately, a year or so after this conversation, walked out on her husband and moved in with a boyfriend. Apparently she was looking for greener pastures. She lived with this guy, according to the reports I heard, for a number of years. And more recently, she was looking to move on. The reason I know that is coincidentally, she propositioned the father, widowed father of a friend of mine, for a relationship. And she was point blank said, "I'm planning on leaving my boyfriend. He's in failing health. And I can make you happy." All of which is evidence that character, good or bad, is its own reward. And at least in some cases, beauty really is only skin deep. A good friend of mine, really a close friend, a number of years ago, was going through a period of stress. It was an extended and a protracted period of stress in his life, and it triggered a bout of depression, which he didn't recognize as depression at the time. He'd always been a stable, well-functioning guy. And actually it wasn't the stress that triggered the depression, it was how he reacted to it. But he was in a prolonged period of hopelessness and despair. It wasn't just a bad day or even a bad week, but really an extended period of time. He said it was like a black hole, and he couldn't seem to get out of it. Finally, being a pretty sound mind otherwise, he decided he needed some help. He said his pride told him he could gut it out, but he said he needed to get back on his feet and functioning properly. So he went to a Christian counseling center, had a psychological profile test done on himself, met with not one but two psychiatrists who diagnosed him as dealing with moderate depression. They put him on some medication for hopefully what would be a short period of time till he got himself stabilized, and then he went and met with a therapist for a while to try and get at the root of what was triggering this depression and how he was reacting improperly in a way that would trigger this and hopefully get it under control or dispense with it. During this time, my friend's problems created some stress in his marriage. His wife happened to mention all of this to a friend of hers from church. The problem was this so-called church friend confronted my friend in the parking lot one morning after church services. She literally got up in his face and said she'd been watching him and she had determined that he was suffering from mania, severe delusional mood swings resulting from a chemical imbalance in his brain. All of which caught my friend off guard, and he said his first reaction was whether if he was suffering delusions, whether he should maybe sell his house and move into a cardboard box on the street, or maybe move to New York and try and buy the Brooklyn Bridge. At any rate, he corrected his wife's church friend with the proper diagnosis and basically politely told her to sit down and shut up. Question is, what prompted this friend to diagnose him? And he did say she was like a dog with a sock in its mouth. She wouldn't let go of it. She was absolutely blunt in his face and certain of her conclusions. Well, the fact is, this was a middle-aged widow with raised children, and she had enough time on her hands that she decided to go back to school and become a nurse. At the point of contact with my friend, she'd apparently read a textbook, or maybe only part of a textbook, on clinical psychology as part of her nursing curriculum. She had no methodology, had performed no diagnosis, done no testing. She had no certifications in anything as a psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist, or anything else. What apparently she had was too much time on her hands, and she was using it to make judgments about other people. The good news is she confronted him and didn't limit her discussions to talking behind his back. Anyway, the matter should have ended there, but it didn't. My friend said about a year later, he was sitting at the kitchen table having breakfast with his two twin daughters, about age 12 at the time. His wife wasn't there for some reason, but he said he was giving them advice on some minor matter, which he doesn't even remember now. And at one point he got up to get himself a cup of coffee, and he had his back turned towards the girls at the table. When he turned her back around, coffee in hand, he noticed one daughter caught in the act of pointing her finger at her head in a kind of a he's nuts gesture. At the same time, the other daughter was rolling her eyes. He said this stunned him. He said his girls had never been anything less than respectful towards he and his wife. They'd never had any problems within the household. They were a close-knit family, spent a lot of time together, and he had no basis for understanding where this gesture and attitude came from. He thought enough of the incident as he was chewing on it that the following day he called his wife from work. He explained what happened, and he asked her for her opinion. He said she'd been really quiet on the end of the phone as he was describing this, which in itself set off an alarm bell. And he finally just came out and asked her, he said, "What have you been talking to the girls about concerning me?" He said there was a really long pause at this point, and finally his wife just spit it out. She said, "I told them that you have a chemical imbalance in your brain and we need to deal with it as a family." That term, he said, chemical imbalance in the brain, triggered a recollection of his confrontation in the parking lot with the so-called church friend a year earlier. Apparently, when he corrected the record with her and told her to stand down, she didn't, but continued to talk about it to the point where it had now affected his family. He made two interesting observations at this point. He's told me, he said, I always considered myself to be well-balanced, well-adjusted, and really high functioning as an individual. He said, the problem is I no longer have any idea who the husband and father is that resides in the minds of my wife and daughters. Clearly that person had been replaced by the product of gossip. There's now a counterfeit person living in their minds. That's what gossip does. It kills the person you know and replaces them with something worse, always worse, and always counterfeit. He said one other thing came to his mind at that time. He said he had been aware, just vaguely aware, that people that he'd worked with and been friends with and served with at church had seemed to gradually drift away from him, and some of them seemed to actually be keeping their distance. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on, so he wasn't really all that concerned about it other than just a vague awareness until this point. He said now it was like a light bulb going off and he recognized that he had been being gossiped about behind his back.